You can call me the hunter. Not because I hunt animals but because I specialize in problems that most people couldn't even imagine. I'm an ex-military man, a veteran of wars I'd rather not remember. My reputation precedes me. I'm the guy they call when everything else has failed, when the situation is so desperate that there's no other option. Today was no different. The phone rang in the middle of the night, breaking the silence of my apartment. It was an unfamiliar number, but something in the tone of the call made me answer. The voice on the other end was serious, urgent. We have a situation at a secret facility in the middle of a forest. Something has gone wrong, very wrong. We need your expertise. Can you come? I didn't think twice. I'm always up for a challenge, but this time there was something different. Something in that man's voice made me feel like this wouldn't be just any mission. I hung up the phone, grabbed my gear, and headed out into the woods. The place was isolated, as if the world had forgotten it. The road wound through tall, dark trees, and the fog was so thick I could barely see past the hood of my truck. When I arrived at the facility, I knew immediately that something was terribly wrong. The front door was open, gently swaying in the wind. There were no guards, no lights, no sounds, just an eerie silence that dug into my bones. I entered cautiously, my gun in hand. The interior was chaos, papers strewn across the floor, equipment torn apart, and blood stains that looked fresh. Something had happened here, something horrible. I found a monitor that still worked, displaying security footage. The recordings were blurry, but I could make out figures. Something that wasn't human, something that moved with an agility and ferocity that shouldn't exist. In that moment, I knew. This wouldn't be a normal mission. This was something darker, more dangerous. And I, the hunter, was right in the middle of it. But no matter how much you prepare, you're never ready for what awaits you in the dark. Especially when the darkness is watching you. The silence in the facility was overwhelming. Every step I took echoed through the empty hallways, as if the building itself was watching me. Lights flickered, creating shadows that moved in the corners of my vision. I knew I wasn't alone. Something was there waiting. I moved forward cautiously, checking each room. In one I found a trashed laboratory. Broken test tubes, machines ripped from the walls, and in the center of the room a cage large enough to hold a man or something larger. The bars were bent outward, as if whatever was inside had escaped with superhuman strength. On a nearby table there were documents scattered. I picked them up and began to read. They spoke of an experiment, something called Project Fenrir. It was reportedly an attempt to create super soldiers using DNA from forest predators. Wolves, bears, even big cats. But something went wrong. The subjects began to mutate, becoming stronger, faster, and far smarter than anyone had anticipated. A security recording on the nearby monitor caught my attention. I played it back. At first, it just showed the scientists at work monitoring the subjects in their cages. But then something changed. The creatures began to stir as if they sensed something the humans in the room couldn't see. Suddenly one of the cages opened. It wasn't a mistake, it wasn't an accident. The creature inside had tampered with the controls. Chaos erupted within seconds. The creatures leapt at the scientists, their movements fast and brutal. Screams filled the room, but they didn't last long. Within minutes all was silent. The recording ended with a blurry image of one of the creatures staring directly into the camera, its eyes glowing with a disturbing intelligence. I turned off the monitor, but the image of those eyes wouldn't leave my mind. I knew those things were here, in this place, and probably in the forest around me. They weren't just beasts, they were hunters. And I was their prey. Just then I heard a noise behind me. A rustling sound like something big was moving in the dark. I turned quickly, my gun ready. But I saw nothing. Just shadows, and the sound of something breathing very close. I didn't have time to think. I knew I had to move, find a safe place, figure out what had happened here and how to stop it. But one thing was clear. This would not be a rescue mission. This would be a survival mission. The sound of that breathing. I'll never forget it. It was deep, raspy, like it came from something that wasn't quite animal but not quite human either. I moved slowly, pointing my gun into the darkness, but I saw nothing. Just shadows dancing on the walls, created by the flickering lights. I knew I couldn't stay there. I had to move. I left the lab and walked into the hallways of the facility. Every door I passed was open, every room empty, or so it seemed. I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. Every few steps I stopped, listening. But I heard only the sound of my own breathing and the occasional creak of the building. I came to a control room. Screens showed images from security cameras scattered around the facility. At first, everything seemed normal, empty hallways, silent rooms. But then, on one of the screens I saw movement. Something large, dark, moving with unnatural agility. I couldn't quite make out what it was, but I knew it wasn't human. On another screen I saw something that made my blood run cold. One of the creatures was there, in the hallway just outside the control room. It was huge, with misshapen musculature and a gaze that seemed to pierce through the camera. Its eyes glittered with a disturbing intelligence, as if it knew exactly what it was doing. And then, slowly, it raised a claw and pointed toward the camera, as if it were challenging me. Just then I heard a knock on the control room door. I turned, pointing my gun at the entrance. The knock was repeated, louder this time. The door shook in its frame. I knew it wouldn't hold for long. I quickly looked around, searching for an exit. There was a window at the back of the room, but it was barred shut. The knock on the door intensified. I could hear the sound of splintering wood. I had no time to think. I grabbed a chair and threw it against the window. The glass shattered, but the bars were still there. I stepped closer and tried with all my might to bend them. They wouldn't budge. Behind me, the door began to give way. The hinges creaked, and a piece of wood flew through the air. The creature was entering. Its eyes found me, and its mouth opened in a grotesque grin, displaying rows of sharp teeth. There was no time for fear. I grabbed a grenade from my belt, activated it, and threw it toward the door. The explosion was deafening. The shockwave knocked me to the ground, and debris flew all over the room. When I stood up, the door was gone and the creature was gone. But I knew I hadn't killed it. These things didn't die that easily. I climbed out the broken window, cutting myself on the glass, but I didn't care. I had to get to the woods. Out there, at least, I'd have room to move, to fight. But I also knew the creatures were there, waiting for me. And this time there wouldn't be just one. There would be many. The cold air of the forest hit me in the face as soon as I stepped out of the facility. The fog was even thicker here, enveloping everything in a gray blanket that made it impossible to see beyond a few meters. I knew the creatures were there, somewhere in the trees, stalking me. But I had no choice. I had to get deeper into the forest if I wanted to survive. I ran, stepping on dry leaves and broken branches. Every sound made me turn my head, expecting to see a dark figure emerge from the fog. But I saw nothing, at least not at first. Then I heard a low, guttural growl coming from my left. I stopped short, holding my breath. The sound repeated itself, closer this time. I aimed my gun in the direction of the noise, but saw nothing. Just trees and fog. Then something moved. It was fast, almost imperceptible, but I saw it. A large shadow, slipping through the trees with an agility that shouldn't be possible. My heart was pounding and I felt cold sweat running down my back. I decided to keep moving, but more cautiously this time. I knew the creatures were toying with me, testing my limits. They weren't just beasts, they were hunters and I was their prey. Every step I took was calculated, every movement careful. But no matter how hard I tried, I couldn't escape the feeling that I was being watched. I came to a clearing in the woods. The fog was less dense here, and the moonlight illuminated the leaf-covered ground. For a moment I felt a little safer. But then I heard a rustling behind me. I turned quickly but saw nothing. Then another rustling, this time to my right. And another to my left. They were surrounding me. Suddenly a figure emerged from the fog. It was one of the creatures, but this time I saw it clearly. It was huge, with misshapen musculature and skin that seemed to be constantly changing, as if its body couldn't decide what form to take. Its eyes glittered with a disturbing intelligence, and its mouth opened in a grotesque grin, displaying rows of sharp teeth. I didn't wait for it to attack. I fired again and again, but the creature moved too fast. It dodged my bullets with an agility that seemed impossible. Then it leapt at me, its claws extended. I threw myself to the ground, rolling to avoid the attack, but I felt a sharp pain in my arm. Its claws had reached me. I quickly got up, ignoring the pain. I knew I couldn't stay there. I ran into the trees, seeking shelter, but the creature was right behind me. I heard its heavy breathing, its footsteps echoing on the ground. I knew I couldn't run forever. Then I saw something, a fallen tree with a trunk big enough to hide behind. I crept up behind it, holding my breath. The creature stopped, sniffing the air. I could hear it moving, searching for me. I knew it hadn't seen me, but it wouldn't last long. At that moment, I remembered something I'd read in the facility's documents. The creatures were intelligent, yes, but they also had a weakness: their reliance on sound. They were hunters, but they were also prey to their own instincts. I grabbed a rock from the ground and threw it as far as I could. The rock hit a tree and the sound echoed through the forest. The creature turned its head toward the sound, and then, with a snarl, it darted in that direction. I didn't wait to see if it would come back. I got up and ran in the opposite direction, deeper into the forest. I knew I wasn't safe, but at least I'd bought myself some time. But one thing was clear, I couldn't keep running forever. I had to find a way to fight to stop them. Because if I didn't, the forest would be my grave, and those creatures, my executioners. The forest seemed to have no end. Every step I took me deeper into its darkness, and every shadow seemed to hide a new threat. My arm was bleeding, but I couldn't stop. I knew the creatures were close, and that they wouldn't rest until they found me. As I ran, I began to remember the documents I had seen in the facility. They spoke of an enzyme, something called the Fenrir Code. It was what had given those creatures their strength, their speed, and their intelligence. But there was something else too, something I hadn't fully understood at the time. The creatures weren't just the result of a failed experiment. They were an evolution. And they were evolving fast. Suddenly, I heard a sound that made me stop dead in my tracks. It was a growl, but not like the ones I had heard before. This one was lower, more guttural, like it came from something bigger, more dangerous. I crouched behind a tree, holding my breath. I knew I couldn't take on another creature, not in my state. But then, I saw something that made me forget about the danger for a moment. On the ground, between the leaves, was a trail of blood. It wasn't mine. It was fresh, and it led to a nearby clearing. I decided to follow it, moving cautiously. Every step was a risk, but I knew I had to find out what had caused that wound. When I reached the clearing, I saw it. It was one of the creatures, but this time it was injured. It had a deep wound in its side, and its breathing was irregular. It seemed to be dying. I approached it slowly with my weapon ready, but the creature didn't attack me. Instead, it looked at me with those bright eyes, filled with an intelligence that chilled my blood. And then it spoke. It wasn't a human sound, but it wasn't completely animal either. It was a distorted, guttural voice, but the words were clear. You don't understand what you've awakened. I froze. Was it talking? Were they capable of that? The creature tried to get up, but fell back to the ground, groaning in pain. Its gaze wouldn't leave me, and I felt like it was judging me, like it knew something I didn't. You can't win, it whispered before its body convulsed and went still. I stood there, staring at the creature's corpse, trying to process what had just happened. They weren't just beasts, they were something else. Something that could think, talk, plan. And if one of them was hurt, what had caused that hurt? Another creature? Or something worse? At that moment, I heard a noise behind me. I turned quickly, but I saw nothing. Only trees and fog. But I knew I wasn't alone. Something was there, watching me, waiting for the right moment to strike. I couldn't just stand there. I had to move, find a safe place, figure out how to stop this. But one thing was clear. This wouldn't be a battle of strength. This would be a battle of wits. And if these creatures were as smart as they seemed, I would have to outwit them. The forest wasn't just a place of escape anymore, it was a battlefield. And I, the hunter, would have to become the prey fighting for its life. The forest had become a labyrinth of shadows and disturbing sounds. Every step I took made me feel more vulnerable, more exposed. I knew the creatures were there, stalking me, waiting for the perfect moment to strike. But I couldn't just stand still. I had to find a way to fight, to survive. As I moved forward, I began to notice something strange. The forest wasn't like any other forest. The trees seemed taller, more twisted, as if they were alive. Branches intertwined in patterns that didn't seem natural. And the air was charged with an energy I couldn't explain. It was as if the forest itself was conspiring against me. I came to a small stream. The water ran slowly and the sound was almost soothing. I bent down to wash the wound on my arm, but at that moment, I heard a noise behind me. I turned quickly, but I saw nothing. Only trees and shadows. Yet, I knew I wasn't alone. I decided to follow the stream, thinking it might lead me to a safer place. But as I continued forward, the feeling of being watched grew more intense. Every few steps I stopped, listening. But I only heard the sound of water and the occasional creaking of branches. Suddenly, the stream opened up into a larger clearing. In the center of the clearing there was a structure. It was small, almost like a hut, but it didn't look like it was made by human hands. The walls were made up of intertwined branches, and the roof was covered in leaves and moss. I approached cautiously, knowing that anything could be waiting for me inside. As I entered, I realized that it wasn't a hut, but rather a shrine of sorts. On the walls, there were symbols carved into the wood, symbols I didn't recognize but that looked ancient, as if they belonged to a forgotten civilization. In the center of the room there was an altar, and on it, an object that immediately caught my attention. It was a glass jar, and inside was a glowing liquid, a color I couldn't describe. I took it carefully, feeling its weight in my hand. I knew it wasn't something ordinary. Could this be the Fenrir Code? The key to stopping the creatures? Just then I heard a noise outside the hut. I turned quickly but saw nothing. However, I knew I wasn't alone. The creatures were there waiting for me. And this time they weren't going to let me get away. I walked out of the cabin with the flask in my hand, ready for whatever was coming. I knew I couldn't keep running away. I had to face them, use what I had found to fight. But one thing was clear: this wouldn't be an easy battle. The creatures were smart, fast, and deadly. And I, the hunter, would have to outwit them. The forest wasn't just a place of escape anymore, it was a battlefield. And I, the hunter, would have to become the prey fighting for its life. The flask in my hand seemed to weigh more than it was. The glowing liquid inside it pulsed gently, as if it had a life of its own. I didn't know what it was, but something in my gut told me it was important. Maybe it was the key to stopping the creatures, or maybe it was something worse. I had no time to hesitate. The shadows around me moved, and I knew I wasn't alone. I decided to try the liquid. There was no other option. If it was poison, at least I would die quickly. If it was something else, well, I would have to take my chances. With a quick movement, I opened the vial and drank its contents. The taste was metallic, almost electric, and I felt a rush of heat run through my body. For a moment, I thought I had made a terrible mistake. But then something changed. My vision sharpened. I could see every leaf on the trees, every shadow in the fog. My ears picked up sounds I wouldn't have noticed before: the creaking of a branch hundreds of feet away, the rustling of the wind through the trees. My body felt lighter, faster, as if it had awakened something inside me. But I also felt something else, something dark. A voice in my mind, whispering things I didn't understand. It was as if the liquid hadn't just enhanced my senses, it had awakened something inside me as well. Something that shouldn't have been awakened. At that moment, the creatures attacked. They emerged from the mist like ghosts, their eyes glowing with a ferocity that chilled the blood. But this time I didn't feel helpless. I moved my body with an agility I didn't know I had, dodging their claws and counterattacking with deadly precision. My gun seemed to move on its own, each shot finding its mark. But the creatures weren't easy to defeat. Though slower than me, they were intelligent. They worked as a team, surrounding me, trying to wear me down. I knew I couldn't keep up this pace for long. I had to find a way to finish them off once and for all. Then I remembered something. In the facility's documents, there was a mention about a sound frequency that affected the creatures. I didn't know if it would work, but I had nothing to lose. I pulled out my radio and began to tune the frequency, searching for the right one. The creatures were getting closer, but I didn't stop. Finally, I found the frequency. A high-pitched, almost imperceptible sound began to emit from the radio. The creatures stopped as if paralyzed by the sound. Their eyes flashed with confusion and then pain. One of them fell to the ground, writhing, while the others backed away, disoriented. I knew I wouldn't last long. I had to act fast. I grabbed a grenade from my belt, activated it, and threw it toward the group of creatures. The explosion was deafening, and when the smoke cleared, the creatures lay on the ground, motionless. But I didn't feel victorious. I knew it wasn't over. The liquid in my body was still burning, and the voice in my mind was louder than ever. What had that liquid done to me? What was it turning me into? The forest was still there, silent, watching me. I knew I couldn't stay. I had to find answers before it was too late. But one thing was clear: I wasn't just the hunter anymore. Now I was part of this game too, and I didn't know which side I was on. The forest was no longer the same. Every shadow seemed to move on its own, every sound a threat. The liquid I had drunk still burned in my veins, and the voice in my mind kept whispering. It was as if the forest and I were connected now, as if I was part of it, and it part of me. I knew I couldn't stay there. The creatures I had defeated were just the beginning. There were more, many more, and now they knew I was a threat. I had to find a way to stop this, to stop them before it was too late. I decided to return to the facility. Maybe there I would find answers, something to help me understand what was happening to me. But the way back wouldn't be easy. The creatures were everywhere, and now, with my enhanced senses, I could feel them, smell them, almost hear their thoughts. I moved forward cautiously, avoiding the clearings and staying in the shadows. But no matter how hard I tried, I couldn't escape them. Suddenly, a figure emerged from the mist. It was one of the creatures, but this time it was different. It was larger, darker, and its eyes shone with a blood-curdling intelligence. We stared at each other, and for a moment I felt like I could understand it. It wasn't just a beast, it was something else. Something that had been created but was now out of control. And then it spoke. "You can't win," it whispered, its voice echoing in my mind. "You're one of us now." I didn't want to listen anymore. I fired again and again, but the creature moved too fast. It dodged my bullets with an agility that seemed impossible. Then it leapt at me, its claws extended. I threw myself to the ground, rolling to avoid the attack, but I felt a sharp pain in my arm. Its claws had reached me. I quickly got up, ignoring the pain. I knew I couldn't stay there. I ran into the trees, seeking shelter, but the creature was right behind me. I heard its heavy breathing, its footsteps echoing on the ground. I knew I couldn't run forever. Then I remembered something. In the facility's documents, there was a mention about a sound frequency that affected creatures. I didn't know if it would work, but I had nothing to lose. I pulled out my radio and started adjusting the frequency, looking for the right one. The creatures were getting closer, but I didn't stop. Finally, I found the frequency. A high-pitched, almost imperceptible sound began to emit from the radio. The creatures stopped as if the sound had paralyzed them. Their eyes flashed with confusion and then with pain. One of them fell to the ground, writhing, while the others backed away, disoriented. I knew I wouldn't last long. I had to act fast. I grabbed a grenade from my belt, activated it, and threw it towards the group of creatures. The explosion was deafening, and when the smoke cleared, the creatures lay on the ground, motionless. But I didn't feel victorious. I knew it wasn't over. The liquid in my body was still burning, and the voice in my mind was louder than ever. What had that liquid done to me? What was it turning me into? The forest was still there, silent, watching me. I knew I couldn't stay. I had to find answers before it was too late. But one thing was clear. I wasn't just the hunter anymore. Now I was part of this game too, and I didn't know which side I was on. I walked into the facility, feeling the forest watching me. Every step was a struggle, but I knew I couldn't stop. When I reached the entrance, I realized something had changed. The doors were open, and inside it was quiet. There was no sign of the scientists or the guards. There was only darkness. I entered cautiously, knowing the creatures could be anywhere. But I saw nothing. Only shadows and silence. I reached the lab where it had all started, and there I saw it. In the center of the room there was a figure. It was human, but not quite. Its eyes glowed with a familiar light, and its smile was grotesque. "Welcome, Hunter," the figure said. "We've been waiting for you." I didn't know what to say. I could only watch as the figure came closer. I knew I couldn't trust it, but I couldn't escape either. I was trapped in a game I didn't understand. And then the figure reached out its hand. "Join us," it whispered. "Together we can be stronger. Together we can survive." I didn't know what to do. The liquid in my body burned, and the voice in my mind screamed. I knew I couldn't trust it, but I couldn't deny that it was right either. I wasn't just the hunter anymore. Now I was a part of this too. And then I took her hand. The forest roared around me, and I knew nothing would ever be the same. The hunter had fallen, and something else had been born. Something darker. Something more dangerous. And the world would never know, until it was too late.